Just before this documentary came out, how did you feel about the case coming out? And did you break up with her, or did it just naturally sort of fade out?
It just naturally faded out. We stopped answering each other. She stopped answering when I started asking her more deeply about the case when I got out. And then she would text back, like, are you done asking about it? And I just stopped answering after that.
Right. And how do you feel about the case now and learning the facts that she had her foot on the accelerator, she never pumped the brakes? You know, there was a lot of evidence of her threatening to take his life previously.
Yeah, I think she definitely did it on purpose. It's hard to tell. It's hard to get into someone's head like that. I think she did it on purpose, but I don't know if she thought they weren't going to die and that it was just going to be oh, I scared him, or she just really wanted all of them to die that night. And I feel like it was
There is a moment, a single terrible moment that changes everything. Not for everyone, not all at once. But for three people inside a silver Toyota Camry on a quiet Ohio street in the gray hours before dawn, that moment arrived at 5:30 in the morning on July 31st, 2022. Two of them never had another moment after that. The third one, the one behind the wheel, is still living with it, still living inside it. Trapped, some would say, in a consequence so enormous it bends the rest of her life into something unrecognizable. Her name is Mackenzie Shirilla. She is 21 years old. She is serving 2 concurrent sentences of 15 years to life at the Ohio Reformatory for Women. And she has always said, that she has no idea what happened. No idea, no memory, no intent. The court said otherwise. Before you can understand what happened inside that car, you have to understand what was happening outside of it. You have to go back to Strongsville, Ohio, a suburb of Cleveland, the kind of place where the streets are named Progress and Alameda, where brick commercial buildings sit at intersections like monuments to the mundane, and where the summers stretch long and warm and full of the kind of restlessness that only teenagers seem to feel in their bones. Mackenzie Shirilla grew up here. She was 17 years old in the summer of 2022. By most accounts, she was a girl wrapped in contradictions, bright-eyed in some moments, volatile in others, the kind of person whose presence could fill a room and whose anger could empty one just as fast. She had been dating Dominic Russo for some time. Dominic was 20 years old, a young man with a wide smile and a family who loved him fiercely. He was the kind of person people describe in the past tense with a specific kind of grief, the kind that sounds like disbelief, like they're still waiting for the story to have a different ending. On that July morning, there was a third person in that car, Davian Flanagan, 19 years old, a recent graduate of Strongsville High School. A kid with his whole life organized in front of him like something that hadn't yet been decided. He was in that car because he was Dominic's friend, because that's what friends do. They ride together. They exist in the same orbit. They never imagine that the orbit will collapse. The three of them had been at a gathering that night. They had been smoking marijuana. At some point before dawn, they got into Mackenzie's silver Toyota Camry. Her car, her steering wheel, her foot on the pedal, and they began to drive home. That is the last ordinary moment in this story. At approximately 5:30 in the morning, surveillance cameras in the Strongsville area captured something that would eventually become the cornerstone of a murder prosecution. The footage showed a silver Camry moving at a speed that doesn't belong on a residential street. It wasn't drifting. It wasn't weaving. It was accelerating, deliberately, continuously, toward the Plidco building, a large brick structure sitting at the intersection of Progress and Alameda Drives. The car did not brake. Let that settle for a moment. The car traveling at over 100 miles per hour did not brake. Not once. Not at all. The vehicle's black box, the electronic data recorder embedded in the chassis that captures precise moment-by-moment mechanical decisions, confirmed what the cameras had already shown. Full throttle. No deceleration. No hesitation. The accelerator was pressed to the floor and held there. The impact was devastating. The Camry struck the brick building with a force that investigators would later describe in clinical terms that still couldn't quite capture the violence of it. The car erupted. Dominic Russo and Davian Flanagan were pronounced dead at the scene, killed instantly, their bodies found inside the wreckage of a vehicle that had become, in those final seconds, something no car is meant to become. Mackenzie was found unconscious. Her foot was still on the gas pedal. She survived. 3 broken ribs, a broken femur, lacerated liver, multiple surgeries, weeks in a hospital bed. And then, when she was finally awake and breathing and stable enough to speak, she said she didn't remember any of it. Not the acceleration, not the building, not the sound, not the moment, nothing. In the early hours of the investigation, police treated it as a tragedy, a terrible accident. A young woman who had lost control of her vehicle and paid for it in broken bones, while two young men paid for it in something far more permanent. The families of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan were notified. Grief descended on Strongsville like weather. And then investigators started asking questions. When detectives go back, they rarely find a straight line. What they find is a pattern, a series of moments, behaviors, statements, and incidents that, when laid side by side, begin to look less like coincidence and more like architecture. The architecture of intention. What they found, in the weeks following the crash, was a relationship that had been fracturing for some time. Mackenzie Shirilla and Dominic Russo had been together long enough for the early warmth to have curdled into something more complicated. Witnesses described a dynamic that prosecutors would later characterize as toxic, marked by jealousy, control, volatility, and incidents that had quietly alarmed the people around them. One incident stood out above all others. 2 weeks before the crash, 14 days, give or take, Mackenzie Shirilla had made a statement that no one in that car could have imagined they would need to remember. While driving, with Dominic in the passenger seat, she had said to him, "I'll crash this car right now." She said it out loud, to his face, while she was driving. A witness, a friend of Dominic's, had also observed Shirilla physically strike him as he was getting out of her car. Not a shove, not a push, a strike. The kind of thing that in the moment might be filed away as a bad day, a bad fight. The kind of thing that couples sometimes do and sometimes walk back from. But in the architecture of what came later, it became a brick in the wall of what prosecutors believed this crash really was. The investigation widened. Text messages were examined. Phone records were pulled. Friends were interviewed. The picture that emerged was not of a freak accident or a medical episode or a girl who had simply lost control. It was of a relationship in collapse, of a young woman whose documented anger toward the man sitting in her passenger seat had escalated to a point where investigators believed the unthinkable had become thinkable. And so in 2023, Mackenzie Shirilla, who had survived the crash, survived the surgeries, survived the grief, was charged with murder, not manslaughter, not reckless driving, murder. The trial of Mackenzie Shirilla was a bench trial, meaning there was no jury. The decision about guilt or innocence rested entirely with one person, Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Judge Nancy Margaret Russo. No shared deliberation. No 12 strangers weighing evidence in a back room. One judge, one verdict, one woman's word against the weight of physics, data, and testimony. The prosecution's case was built on layers, each one adding pressure to the one beneath it. First came the black box data. The electronic record of those final seconds before impact was unambiguous in its mechanics. The accelerator had been pressed to full throttle. There had been no application of the brakes. The car had not malfunctioned. The car had not veered unexpectedly. The car had done exactly what it was instructed to do by the foot pressed against the pedal and the hands, or lack of hands, on the wheel. Then came the surveillance footage. The camera didn't interpret. It didn't speculate. It showed a vehicle moving with the kind of purposeful velocity that doesn't happen by accident. That doesn't happen when someone is unconscious at the wheel. That doesn't happen randomly on a quiet Ohio street at 5:30 in the morning. Then came the witnesses. The friend who heard her say she would crash the car. The person who watched her hit Dominic. The accounts of a relationship that had, in the weeks and months before July 31st, been building towards something that no one had stopped because no one could have imagined it would end like this. Then came the crash reconstruction experts. Specialists whose job it is to read the aftermath of collisions the way a doctor reads an X-ray. Their testimony pointed in one direction: the trajectory of the vehicle, the speed, the angle of impact, the absence of any braking action. These were not the signature of a lost control accident. They were the signature of something deliberate. The defense had answers for all of it, or tried to. Mackenzie Shirilla had been diagnosed with a condition called postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, known as POTS. It is a real condition. It affects the autonomic nervous system and can, in some cases, cause dizziness, fainting, and loss of consciousness. The defense suggested, and Shirilla herself would later say in a Netflix documentary, that POTS may have caused her to black out behind the wheel, that the acceleration was not intentional, that she was not there, not conscious, not in control of what her body was doing to that car. She remembered nothing. She maintained this from the moment she woke up in the hospital to the moment she sat in that courtroom to the moment she gave a prison interview years later. Nothing. A complete blank where the crash should be. The prosecution pointed out the obvious and the devastating, that she had just told her boyfriend 2 weeks earlier that she would crash the car. On August 14, 2023, Judge Nancy Margaret Russo delivered her verdict. The courtroom went quiet in the specific way that courtrooms go quiet when everyone in them knows that something irreversible is about to happen. This was not reckless driving, the judge said. This was murder. Mackenzie Shirilla broke down in tears. The verdict was guilty on all 12 felony counts. 4 counts of murder, 4 counts of felonious assault, 2 counts of aggravated vehicular homicide, 1 count of drug possession, 1 count of possessing criminal tools, 12 counts. 12 guilty verdicts read aloud in a courtroom where the families of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan sat and listened and felt something that could not be named but also could not be mistaken. A week later came the sentencing. Judge Russo stood before Mackenzie Shirilla and said what she had concluded after examining every piece of evidence, every testimony, every second of surveillance footage, every data point extracted from a black box that had recorded the truth of those final terrible seconds. There's only one person who's responsible for the pain of every person in this room, the judge said. And that person is you, Mackenzie. Nobody else is responsible. She called what Shirilla had done a selfish, intentional, and cruel decision. She sentenced her to 15 years to life in prison on the murder counts, 2 concurrent life sentences, not consecutive, a mercy of the law that meant Shirilla would be eligible for parole in 15 years rather than 30. The prosecutor had described Shirilla's conduct as demonstrating a shocking lack of remorse. Mackenzie Shirilla was 19 years old when she was sentenced. She had been 17 when she drove that car into that building. She was taken away. The Ohio Reformatory for Women sits in Marysville, Ohio, about an hour southwest of Columbus, a distance from Strongsville that is measured not just in miles but in the particular geography of incarceration. It is a place with rules and schedules and walls, a place where time moves differently, where the outside world exists only in letters and phone calls and the controlled, supervised visits that constitute human contact. Mackenzie Shirilla has been inside those walls since her conviction. She is 21 years old now. She went in as a teenager, and she will still be a relatively young woman if everything goes according to the terms of her sentence, if parole is granted at the earliest opportunity, when she first becomes eligible to leave. 15 years from sentencing, she will be in her 30s. But in the Netflix documentary The Crash, which premiered on May 15, 2026, nearly 4 years after the collision and nearly 3 years after the conviction, Shirilla gave interviews from inside the reformatory. She sat and spoke about her life now, about her memories of what happened, and her continued insistence that she has no memories at all about the crash and the verdict and the sentence that has become the architecture of her existence. Anyone can see there's no intent, she said. And then, in almost the same breath, I have no recollection of that morning, but I know it wasn't intentional. Sit with that for a moment. Hold both of those statements at the same time. She has no memory of the morning, and yet she knows, she is certain, that it was not intentional. How do you know the nature of an action you cannot remember taking? How do you claim certainty about intent when the entire event is, by your own account, a void? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions that the legal system spent considerable time and resources attempting to answer, and the legal system arrived at its answer. Her attorneys have continued to appeal. Courts have continued to uphold the conviction. In March 2026, an Ohio appeals court denied a further appeal, not on the merits of the case, but because the petition had been filed one day after the 365-day jurisdictional deadline. One day, the Ohio 8th District Court of Appeals upheld the trial court's decision to refuse consideration. The door closed, not with a dramatic ruling, not with a final argument, with a calendar. One day late, the sentence stands. There is something specific that happens when a case like this enters the public consciousness in the way that the Mackenzie Shirilla case has. When the Netflix documentary drops and the algorithm delivers it to millions of screens and people who had never heard of Strongsville, Ohio find themselves watching surveillance footage of a silver Camry accelerating toward a brick building at 100 miles per hour. Some of them feel horror. Some feel grief for the families of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan, 2 young men whose names have become attached to a crime rather than to the lives they lived, the people who loved them, the futures they were robbed of. Some feel something more complicated about Mackenzie Shirilla, that dissonance that emerges when the perpetrator is also young, also human, also someone who was once somebody's child. And some of them, a significant number, if the comment sections and online forums are any indication, are not sure what to believe. Not sure if the Potts defense was more credible than the court gave it credit for. Not sure if a 17-year-old girl really accelerated a car to 100 miles per hour with the deliberate intention of killing the boy she had been dating. Not sure if the prior statement, "I'll crash this car right now," was a genuine threat or a moment of teenage rage that nobody in any fair assessment of human behavior would have taken literally. These doubts exist in the public square. They are real. They matter, not because they change the legal outcome. They don't. But because they illuminate something important about how we process cases like this, about how difficult it is for the human mind to hold the idea of a 17-year-old girl as a murderer, about how instinctively we reach for alternative explanations because the real one feels too dark, too deliberate, too cold. The court did not have that luxury. The court had the black box. The court had the footage. The court had the witnesses and the statements and the reconstruction and the prior threat. The court looked at all of it and arrived at a conclusion that the law requires to be stated in plain terms. Mackenzie Shirilla intentionally killed 2 people. The families of those people have had to live with that knowledge, and with everything that comes before knowledge, which is the absence of the person you loved, and the endless, unanswerable question of why. Dominic Russo's family has been vocal. They have attended hearings. They have spoken at sentencing. They have carried the specific weight of people who lost someone at the hands of someone that person trusted. Dominic was in that car because he was with his girlfriend. He was in the passenger seat. He had no warning, no ability to intervene, no moment in which he could have changed what was already in motion. Davian Flanagan's family carries their own version of this. He was 19 years old. He had just graduated high school. He was in that car because his friend was in that car. Because that's how it works when you're young, and the night runs long, and someone offers you a ride home. You don't calculate the risk. You get in. 2 families. 2 sets of parents, siblings, friends, extended circles of people whose lives were altered on July 31st, 2022, and who have had to watch everything that came after. The investigation, the charges, the trial, the verdict, the documentary, the continued public debate about whether the verdict was right, and process it all while still waking up every morning in a world where their people are not. That is the weight that sits beneath this case. Not the legal arguments, not the black box data, not the question of pots or memory or intent. The weight is 2 young men who are gone, and the people who love them who are still here. When the documentary aired, there was a particular quality to the public reaction that's worth examining. Mackenzie Shirilla, speaking from inside the reformatory, came across as composed in some moments, pained in others, consistent in her insistence that she remembers nothing and intended nothing. Some viewers found her credible. Some found her chilling. Some found her both simultaneously, which may be the most honest response available. What's harder to look away from is the gap between what she says and what the evidence established. She says she has no memory. The black box says the car was at full throttle. She says she couldn't have intended this. The surveillance footage says the car did not brake. She says the POTS diagnosis explains the void in her memory. The prosecution says the prior threat explains the acceleration. These 2 narratives cannot both be entirely true. One of them describes a tragedy. The other describes a crime. The court decided which one it believed. And yet, and this is the part that documentaries like The Crash understand instinctively, the court's decision doesn't close the feeling of the case. It closes the legal question. The human question remains open in a way that human questions always do, because human beings are not data, and grief is not a verdict. And the fact that something's been decided doesn't mean it has been resolved. Mackenzie Shirilla is 21 years old in prison. She will be 32 at her earliest parole eligibility, assuming the 15-year clock runs cleanly. She will have spent those years in a facility where time is structured around rules and restrictions and the particular monotony of incarceration, where the outside world continues without her, where Dominic Russo's family continues to grieve without him. Is that justice? The law says yes. The law has processes and standards and mechanisms for deciding what justice looks like, and those mechanisms were applied here. 12 felony convictions, 15 years to life. The appeals courts affirming the verdict. The system working as designed. Whether the system's design captures everything that matters is a different question, one that courts are not really built to answer, but that human beings cannot stop asking. There is something that prison does to a person, not just the physical confinement, not just the loss of liberty, but something more interior. Something that happens when every day looks essentially like the last one, and every future looks like a negotiation with a parole board that may or may not decide that you have changed enough to be returned to the world you left behind. Mackenzie Shirilla entered the Ohio Reformatory for Women as a teenager. The person she is becoming inside those walls, who she is at 21, who she will be at 25, at 30, at 32, when she first becomes eligible to sit before a parole board and make the case for her release. That person is being formed in a context that most of us will never experience and cannot fully imagine. What does she think about in the quiet hours? Does she think about Dominic Russo, about the relationship that prosecutors said had become toxic, about the fight that may have preceded the crash, about the boy who trusted her with his life and whose life ended in the wreckage of her car? Does she think about Davian Flanagan, who had no part in whatever was happening between them, who was simply present and therefore caught in the radius of something catastrophic? Does she run the morning of July 31st, 2022 through her mind and still find only blankness? Or has memory crept back in the years since, filling in the dark space with something she hasn't said publicly? We don't know. We can't know. The interior of another person is always closed to us, and the interior of someone incarcerated for murder is closed in ways that go beyond the ordinary opacity of selfhood. What we know is what the record shows. What we know is that 2 young men are dead. What we know is that a judge examined the evidence and concluded that their deaths were not an accident. What we know is that the person held responsible for those deaths is now living out the consequences in a facility an hour from where it happened. In a life that looks nothing like the one she was living when she was 17 in summer was endless and everything felt survivable. There's a question that sits underneath all true crime coverage, underneath the evidence and the verdicts and the sentences and the documentaries, and it's not really about the specific case. It's about what we do with cases like this, what they tell us, what they're supposed to change. Because if the story of Mackenzie Shirilla is just a story, just a strange and terrible thing that happened in Strongsville, Ohio, to 3 specific people, then it has a beginning and a middle and an end. And the end is a 21-year-old in prison and 2 families in grief and a Netflix documentary that people watch and discuss and eventually move past. But if the story is something more than that, if it's a portrait of something recognizable, something that exists not just in that car, but in the broader landscape of how young people in volatile relationships escalate toward the unthinkable, then it demands more than passive consumption. It demands the uncomfortable question of what warning signs look like before they become evidence. It demands the harder conversation about why people stay in situations that have clearly become dangerous. It demands that we look at the 14 days between I'll crash this car right now and the moment the car actually crashed and ask ourselves what in those 2 weeks might have made a difference. The answer to that question is not satisfying. It never is. Because the answer involves interventions that didn't happen, conversations that weren't had, warnings that weren't taken seriously, because they rarely are until they are too late. Dominic Russo heard her say it, and he got back in the car. That is not a judgment of him. It is a statement about how human beings move through the world, how we minimize, how we rationalize, how we tell ourselves that the thing someone said in anger was just something said in anger. How we get in the car. The title of the Netflix documentary is simple, The Crash, as though it were one thing, as though it were a moment rather than a process, as though the crash itself were the story, rather than everything that led to it and everything that followed. But the crash is the middle. The crash is the hinge around which all of this turns. Before it, 3 young people, a relationship in trouble, a threat spoken aloud, a gathering, a drive home. After it, 2 deaths, an investigation, a trial, a verdict, a sentence, a prison, a documentary, this video. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, in the 5:30 in the morning dark, on a street in a suburb of Cleveland, at the intersection of Progress and Alameda, a moment that lasted less than a second and will echo for the rest of everyone's lives. The black box recorded it, the court interpreted it, the law defined it. Dominic Russo and Davian Flanagan did not survive it. Mackenzie Shirilla is living inside it still. There are people who will finish watching a video like this and feel certain that justice was done, certain that the verdict was right, the sentence appropriate, the case closed in the only way it could have been closed. They will feel the particular satisfaction of a legal system that functioned as intended, that examined the evidence and arrived at a conclusion grounded in what the facts demanded rather than what the heart preferred. There are other people who will finish watching and feel less certain, who will think about a 17-year-old girl and a POTS diagnosis and a gap in memory that cannot be easily dismissed, who will wonder whether the prior statement was enough to establish premeditation, whether the absence of breaking proves intent rather than unconsciousness, whether the full weight of 2 life sentences landing on someone who was, at the moment of the crash, legally still a child is justice or something adjacent to it. Both of these responses are human. Both of them are in their own way honest. But there is a third response, the one that this kind of case ultimately asks of us, and that is to hold the grief for the dead alongside the complexity of the living, To not let the horror of what happened to Dominic Russo and Davian Flanagan get absorbed into the noise of online debate. To remember that behind the black box data and the surveillance footage and the legal proceedings, there were two young men who were alive and then they weren't, who had families who are still here, who deserved futures that were taken from them on a July morning in Ohio. That is what this story costs. That is what it's about, underneath everything else. Not the verdict, not the prison, not the documentary, the cost. And the cost in this case was 2 lives. Remember their names: Dominic Russo, Davian Flanagan. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think, made you feel, made you sit with something uncomfortable, that discomfort has somewhere to go. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Not because it's content, because it's a conversation about the warning signs we ignore, the moments we minimize, and the price that is sometimes paid when we do. The world gets a little more honest every time someone's willing to have that conversation.